kia ora koutou. Welcome to this session on analysing the New Zealand left. So this afternoon we're just going to be running, having two lovely speakers come and speak to you today for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have time for some questions going up to about 10 to 2. So first of all today we have Michael McClellan from the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is an educational organisation, and he's examining the past and present of the left and what barriers might face a future left. And then after that we'll have the lovely Tyler West, who's a local tutor and author, and who looking at the New Zealand far left with anarchism and socialism. Right. Thank you.
Cool. Alrighty. Hi everyone, how are we doing today?
Hey.
Awesome, great. I'm just going to assemble my materials really quickly, so please bear with me as I kind of paper fumble for a tad. I won't be too obnoxious, I hope. I'm just kind of dealing with space here, and hopefully I don't knock the laptop off its axis here. Okay, so as I was introduced, my name is Michael McClelland. I'm a representative of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is an organization that was founded in Chicago in 2006. Platypus is a member-funded organization, so we're not a political party or a think tank or a protest group, but rather we're an educational organization who aims to clarify the current conditions of the left through understanding its history. This involves hosting public fora, journalism and reading groups that might help us understand what barriers a future left might face. And if you're interested, I've brought some paper materials with me. This is our open publish Platypus review publication that we do. And also, as you can see on the screen there, and on this poster, that we have an upcoming reading group that is actually just starting as of last week and into the weeks moving forward. So I'm delivering this presentation today as a student of Marxism, in as far as I get together with our online reading group every Wednesday night and try to understand the central texts of the Marxist left. My intention in delivering this presentation is not to convince you, but rather to interest you, so that you might come to the reading group and investigate these issues in more detail with us. I aim less to provide answers than to ask questions. Likewise, your questions will be welcome afterwards, no matter how basic, because basic questions can be the most clarifying when it comes to understanding the obstacles that might lie between us and the possibility of a future left movement. The question I'd like to start with is one that, depending on the audience member, might seem to be the most provocative or the most obvious question. That question is, does Marxism even matter? But I want to treat it like a call for investigation, which means putting quotation marks around the word Marxism. What do we understand as Marxism, and what are its issues? My job in this presentation is to offer a few tools that I've picked up from the reading group that might help us clarify what Marxism is, or else where to find it. One of those tools is history. In Platypus, we focus on the history of the left because we think that the narrative one tells about history is a theory or a judgment of the present. Implicitly or explicitly, the way you retell the history of the left provides an account of how the present came to be. Only with this tool can we understand how much the Marxism we deal with today exists in agreement or disagreement with the Marxism of the past. To give some orientation to this investigation, we might look at a passage from Marx himself. So this is from a text we read in the reading group, the Grundrisse, which is kind of like the notebooks that Marx penned prior to his writing of Das Kapital, or Capital. To the modern undisciplined reader, it might appear quite opaque, so just listen carefully. He says, "What is progress, if not the absolute elaboration of man's creative dispositions, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself, the absolute movement of becoming? The ancient conception in which man appears as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man, and wealth the aim of production." If this quote doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. It just means we need to put some things in historical context. For instance, we might begin by looking at its keywords. Marx uses the phrase, the modern world. This is important for understanding how Marx is writing about his own time. That is, how Marxism is a modern phenomenon. What do I mean by modern? Well, first I need to explore how modern society differs from the epoch that came before it. For our purposes, we can refer to pre-modern or ancient society as traditional society, in that it encompasses traditional lifestyles that depended upon agriculture and animal husbandry and so on. This roughly corresponds with the Neolithic era, when from about 10,000 BC, humans in many areas of the globe shifted from hunter-gathering as their primary means of subsistence to a sedentary, settled communal lifestyle. And there are some exceptions, some of whom are in existence today, but the point I'm making is more about history than any particular social group. So that's traditional society. On the other hand, modern society emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the era we live in today, which classical Marxism understands as the bourgeois era. Now, when I use the word bourgeois, I don't mean it in the colloquial sense, nor do I mean the bourgeoisie. So I don't mean bougie either. Bourgeois simply means the condition of being an urban dweller or urban worker, as distinct to that of a peasant or agricultural worker. It's not that everyone suddenly lived in a city, but rather that the urban way of life came to define the bourgeois era. Now that definitions are out of the way, let's follow Marx's lead in comparing traditional and modern society. Let's start with what life was like in traditional society. When Marx talks in his quote about man as the aim of production in traditional society, he means the capacity of man to produce a certain way of understanding himself. In traditional society, people understood themselves in relation to nature. Life was a cycle, as experienced in the rhythms of day and night, the calls of animals, the seasons, the tides, and the moon. The cultural critic Louis Menand writes, quote, "In pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent, meaning from within, internal, in all ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around." If we wanted a convenient shorthand to describe life as it was in traditional society, we might use the word being. As far as we can say that there were freedoms in traditional society, they were freedoms that expressed traditional society's aim to continue as is, to continue unimpeded, just being. Freedom meant living your life in the conditions you were born into. It meant the right to exist without interference, to remain unconquered, for example, to not be sold into slavery, to not be crucified or burned at the stake. This thought would have been comforting, I assume, if you lived as a peasant in medieval Europe, where you were only as free as your place in the great chain of being. Like the majority of people in that era, your relation to society as a whole was thought of as determined by nature or by divinity. But due to a variety of historical contingencies, beginning in the 16th century, so the conquest of the Americas, the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press, the Renaissance, the social order began to change. The old feudal order of peasants, lords, kings, and churches began to buckle under the weight of a new, modern, bourgeois order. Menand, who was quoting earlier, he goes on to describe what life became like in this new era. He says, "In modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo, an absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon." End quote. Excuse me. In the bourgeois era, the ordinary worker's experience of social reality changed. That's what Marx meant in the passage I quoted earlier, when he used the word becoming. Becoming, as opposed to being, is to exist not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Whereas the majority of humans were tied to the land in the feudal caste system, in the bourgeois era, people began to understand themselves and relate to each other and society on the basis of their labour. This was new and different. For the first time in human history, people began travelling long distances outside of their villages and farms to sell their labour, the most prominent effect of which being urbanisation. As a consequence, they saw that their new social relation of labour and exchange had effectively undermined the feudal monarchical systems of old, and they began to form ideas that accounted for this shift in human history. Many of the philosophers of this era, like Rousseau and Hegel to name a few, understood that the dominant characteristic of the new epoch was freedom, but a new kind of freedom. In the new society, freedom meant meaning the possibility of transforming oneself, or to use the German term Selbstaufhebung. A way we might commonly understand this at the University of Otago is in our motto, Sapere Aude, which is Latin for know thyself, or dare to know rather, which is Immanuel Kant's phrase. So too did the urban workers begin to demand certain rights that reflected that shift. As early as the Dutch Revolt and the English Civil War, through to the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, workers demanded rights as a legal protection of the reality they had brought into being with the sale of their labour. They realised political potential in their status as the majority, as opposed to the priestly and warrior castes of old. To the priestly caste and the noble caste, they said, "No, we are the third estate," to paraphrase the title of the Abbé Sieyès' famous pamphlet that was circulated in the French Revolution. It wasn't just that this non-aristocratic, non-priestly portion of society recognised themselves as the producers of wealth. No. They recognised that they themselves were the producers of society. By workers demanding the value of their labour, they produced and reproduced a society based on the value of that labour. Accordingly, they sought a social order that enshrined the right to transform oneself, or, again, Selbstaufhebung, the right to become. The revolutions of the bourgeois era, which were unlike anything the world had seen before, anticipated and responded to the conditions in which capitalism emerged, which were also unlike anything the world had seen before. The new social relation was as alien to the previous traditional society as that society would have been to hunter-gatherers before it. It was only with the Industrial Revolution that the bourgeois social revolution entered crisis. The social instability and abortive revolutions that characterized the Europe of Karl Marx's lifetime reflected a sudden shift. Specifically, the rise of industrial machinery and factories, along with the consolidation of capital and the driving down of wages, along with the first ever appearance of mass unemployment, produced a new class called the proletariat. The urban workers, who had previously owned their labour, became estranged from it, facing a daily reality of having to divide up their day according to the needs of production under the, quote, dark satanic mills, and having to become the custodians of giant faceless machines. The Frankfurt School critic, Max Horkheimer, put it quite well. Quote, "The historical predictions on the fate of bourgeois society have been confirmed. In the system of the free market economy, which pushed men to labour-saving discoveries and finally subsumed them in a global mathematical formula, its specific offspring, machines, have become means of destruction, not merely in the literal sense. They have made not work, but the workers superfluous." Even though labour and human rights laws and economic reform has mitigated the harsh reality that industrial labourers faced in Marx's lifetime, the reason we can still talk about a working class is that the passage from Marx I quoted earlier still holds true. The worker is someone who once produced an enriched existence, as the aim of production, but now exists merely as the means to the end of producing capital. Crucially, this condition is not just the condition of the working class, but of all of society. Let me clarify what I mean. Individually, we might not all neatly fit into the sociological category of working class, as measured by our income and our relationship to employment, cost of living, and so on. But what we do share in common is the fact that we live in an epoch characterized by the existence of there being a working class. And just as the society of this epoch, the epoch of capital, produces us, so too do we reproduce that very historical condition through our labour. We might say then that history is a subjective phenomenon as well as an objective one. This is terrifying, but also it's promising. It means that at the end of the day, the political reconstitution of society is in our hands. Capitalism isn't outside of us, it is us, and nobody else is coming to save us. Accordingly, Marx reasoned that the only way for society to realise the unfulfilled promise of the bourgeois era was for the proletariat to do away with the necessity of there being a proletariat, and to realise this demand politically. Meaning that whereas the abolition of other classes would only reconstitute society, reproduce it, the abolition of the proletariat would necessarily mean society transforming itself. After the failed European revolutions of 1848, after Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx modified his thinking. He saw the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a scary sounding word, I admit, but it doesn't mean a dictatorship in the sense of a despotic totalitarian regime, but rather in the old school Roman Republican sense, which means self-governance of the people to aid the transition from capitalism into communism. No revolution from Marx's time to today has eventuated in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Why does any of this matter? Well, Marxism once thought of capitalism as transitional. Just as the Industrial Revolution brought about labour-saving machinery, it could have ended social domination if the proletariat actualised this potentiality. Thus, classical Marxism thought that capitalism wasn't absolutely good or absolutely bad in itself, but that it was making people suffer like a constant self-undermining of potential, a morning sickness in the first trimester of bourgeois society's pregnancy, a crisis of society itself that pointed beyond to a further freedom. Platypus's aim is to perform a pathology of this potential transformation. If our current society is defined by conditions which point towards freedom, meaning self-transformation, how is society as we currently know it falling short of that potentiality? One way it falls short is in the loss of historical consciousness on the left, which amounts to a liquidation of the aims of Marxism. Without historical consciousness, Marxism becomes what I call mere anti-capitalism. Where Marxism hoped to ameliorate oppression as an effect of capitalism, mere anti-capitalism sees it as the cause. Where Marxism described capitalism as a self-contradiction, an opportunity to take up, negate, move beyond and transform society, mere anti-capitalism naturalizes social domination by grafting onto it trans-historical terms like corruption and greed. Where Marxism saw capitalism as a transitory phase in which bourgeois society comes into crisis, mere anti-capitalism sees capitalism as an economic doctrine or illogical ideology that runs parallel to others and can be switched out for socialism once common sense prevails. Where Marxism witnessed self-contradiction as a historically specific affliction that plagues the powerful as well as the weak, mere anti-capitalism regards modern society as a power struggle. Marxism seeks to clarify the self-contradiction of capital in history. But my point here isn't to demonize mere anti-capitalism, or indeed any other response to alienation under capitalism. We all share in the pain of a society in crisis, and let's face it, it's hard to blame any individual group or cause for attempting to alleviate suffering with quick remedies. But if we understand capitalism as an illness, it's all the more important to get the diagnosis correct before delivering a prognosis. This is why, in Platypus, we try our best to understand the symptoms of the historical present under capitalism without the pretension or illusion that we know better. Likewise, for me to advocate for Marxism per se as an antidote to mere anti-capitalism would imply that I'm the expert on Marxism or that I know what Marxism is. I don't. But with the aid of history, we can aspire to at least know that we don't know. to understand that no single one of us is bigger than history, and no single one of us can step outside of capitalism and correctly recognise it. And through the recognition of our position relative to our society and history, we can hope to see with more clarity. The first step is recognising our misrecognition. And I'll just close by saying, in this regard, the failures of the left to institute world revolution cannot be regarded as a dead end. As long as we understand these failures as historical failures, then we may recognise the seed of potential that lies in failure. This is why history is so important to understanding Marxism. Only if we're open and honest about how Marxism has failed in the past, might we recover some sense of how that looks new, of how what looks new and different in the present is actually the old and a distorted, twisted repetition of the past. And we can hope to avoid that repetition. So Platypus looks at the old left, the new left, and the post-political left in the 80s and 90s, as well as the millennial left of today. And since we take the view that we understand the past through the present, we regard the millennial left as an all-important indication of where the left is at historically. That's our generation, that's us. Which doesn't give us any answers, just a gravely serious question. This is the task that Platypus is attempting to recover, and this is why our founding motto is, the left is dead, long live the left. Thank you.
And just hold your questions. We'll have some time for that after Tyler speaks as well. Awesome, so I'll just close this.
Cool, I'll grab my phone.
Oh, yep, cool.
Thank you.